Good evening, Endo Summit crowd, and welcome to the first ever Endo Summit fertility webinar. Tonight, we are joined by Dr. Norbert Gleischer and also our very own Emma Lazzaroni. Emma, go ahead and introduce yourself, and then Dr. Gleischer.
Of course. So good evening, everyone, and welcome to this first fertility webinar episode. Emma here. I spent almost 20 years in the IVF lab as a senior embryologist and reproductive scientist. And over time, I shift from bench work to dedicating myself to patient education and research in endometriosis, fertility, and reproductive immunology. So first of all, before we start, I want to really thank Sally for organizing this event and for her continued leadership in elevating women's health through education and advocacy. Okay, so, well, tonight we are gonna talk about a very, let's say, hot topic, PGTA, pre-implantation genetic testing for aneuploidy. And here we have the super prestigious Dr. Gleicher.
Thank you. Thank you, Emma, and thank you, Sally.
Very welcome.
It's a pleasure being here and being able to talk to you about the subject very dear to my heart of pre-implantation genetic testing for aneuploidy, which I have been deeply involved with for over 20 years, since I was present pretty much at the birth of the subject in those days in Chicago, when a colleague and friend and competitor by the name of Yuri Verlinsky really for the first time proposed the concept. And very much convinced me that he had solved IVF and brought IVF into a new time period. But it didn't take very long when I started getting doubts about the concept, and the rest has become a little bit of history, and I will be talking about to you today.
Okay, so actually, I would like to say something that might be nice, actually, because I've been working, I work for Dr. Gleischer for 9 years, right, Dr. Gleischer?
Mm-hmm.
And I was his...
And she did a great job, and we missed her very much when she left.
And I'm very affectionate to CHR. For me, it's like home, and so I'm very happy for having you here tonight. So, and also I want to say something that I underwent my own IVF treatment at CHR, where I was the embryologist of my own embryos, right, Dr. Gleischer?
I can confirm that. She got off the table and went into the lab.
After the retrieval, right?
Yeah.
And actually, I had my 2 daughters, right? And
yes.
So I'm very close to CHR. For me is honestly like home. So, and with Dr. Gleischer, when I was working as an embryologist, and when he started also his research on PGTA, I was there. And I was part of his team. And definitely this topic for me is very, not only interesting, but very important too. Okay, so Dr. Gleischer, are you ready to start with your presentation?
I'm ready.
Great.
As ready as one can be. Okay. So my subject today is an update on PGTA. It is really a a short update on, by now, over 20 years of history, because everything started over 20 years ago. I want to start with my conflict statements. There is really nothing in this talk that anyway should be a conflict of any kind. So this is probably the paper, and you can see the date, 1995,
Mhm.
where PGTA was born. It then had a different name. It was called, by some people, pre-implantation genetic screening, by others, pre-implantation genetic testing. The term pre-implantation genetic testing for aneuploidy was really applied only several years later. And as you can see, that the senior author of this paper was a gentleman by the name of Yuri Verlinsky, who was a geneticist initially working at Northwestern University in Chicago, but later really opening his own laboratory, IVF laboratory and genetic testing laboratory. And I have to say he was not only a friend, colleague, and competitor later on, but he was also a genius. And he was not only the person who proposed the concept of PGTA and said every IVF cycle, every embryo will be tested chromosomally sometimes in the future. But he had also beforehand made pretty big contribution. He was basically the person who invented CVS in early pregnancy diagnosis. He was just a brilliant man. And when he first told me about this concept of testing embryos chromosomally, I thought it was absolute genius. And I, at that time, was a young department chairman of obstetrics of an obstetrics and gynecology program at Mount Sinai in Chicago. And I decided I have to start a lab. And I hired a PhD to start what then was called PGS laboratory. But then, and that is Yuri Verlinsky. Unfortunately, he passed at a relatively young age and is no longer with us. Now, what he proposed was the so-called PGS/PGTA hypothesis, which really basically says that PGS can correctly, and the emphasis is on correctly, deselect abnormal embryos. In other words, anybody who believes that PGTA should be done in an IVF cycle, or at least in some IVF cycles, must believe that this test can really tell us this is a good embryo and this is a bad embryo. This embryo can be transferred, this embryo should not be transferred and should probably be discarded. Well, the idea behind it was, and this idea came from miscarriage studies, that if we screen out chromosomal abnormal embryos, the remaining embryos will give us a better pregnancy chance. And obviously, subsequently, a better live birth chance. And there will be obviously fewer miscarriages. And there should be a shorter time to pregnancy, therefore. In other words, we are not going to waste time and embryos on unnecessary transfers. Unfortunately, this hypothesis, and it is important to understand that this always was just a hypothesis, because a hypothesis becomes a reality only after you can prove it. And unfortunately, now over 20 years later, nobody has still been able to prove this hypothesis that this test can accurately discriminate between chromosomal normal and chromosomal abnormal embryos. And indeed, especially over the last 10 years, the evidence that was produced was not only not proving the hypothesis, but actually disproved the hypothesis in many ways, in that it explained the physiology of early implantation and early embryo growth, and demonstrated why the hypothesis couldn't work. And that is obviously a very, very strong argument against PGTA. And it culminated in September of 2024 when the ASRM finally came out with a policy statement where for the first time ASRM and SART concluded that PGTA really does not do any of the things it had promised. It does not improve pregnancy rate. It does not improve live birth rates. It does not reduce miscarriage rates. It does not shorten time to pregnancy as a routine test, as a test in the general population. What the ASRM opinion, however, did not do, unfortunately, in my opinion, it didn't take the next obvious and logical step, which would, in my opinion, be if something doesn't work, if something hasn't worked for 20 years, indeed has been shown that it cannot be worked, why are we still doing it? This question, the ASRM to this day has not asked, and in my opinion, and that is obviously a mistake, it is in a way unethical, and it has resulted in PGTA still being widely used and patients paying a lot of money for something that everybody now has to acknowledge doesn't do anything. Indeed, in certain subpopulations, as we now already know, PGTA actually can hurt you. And it is important for you to understand this concept that PGTA not only does not improve IVF outcome, but paradoxically, what is meant to help our infertile patients in many subgroups actually hurts them. And I want to give you just two quick examples. The first example is that I want you to think about why are we culturing so many patients nowadays to blastocyst stage? Give me one reason. Better pregnancy rates? Really not true. The data is now very strong that there is no big difference between in cumulative pregnancy rates for a single embryo cohort from a single IVF cycle, whether you transfer those embryos on day 3 at cleavage stage or on day 5 or 6 at blastocyst stage. But just think about how more expensive it is to culture every embryo to blastocyst stage. But that's not even the biggest problem. The biggest problem is that most arrests happen between days 3 and 5. Now, many colleagues say, okay, so what? Because if an embryo in a good laboratory doesn't make it to day 5, it would also not make it to day 5 in the uterus. except that that is not correct. And how do we know that now? We know it because when you really look carefully into the data, you see that if there is an advantage between cleavage stage and blastocyst stage, especially in older patients who have fewer embryos, the advantage is usually with cleavage stage. And there's only one explanation for that. And that explanation is that while our colleagues who believe that embryos that don't make it to blastocyst stage usually won't make it in the uterus either, in a majority is correct, but there are some, probably a relatively small group of embryos, which, while they don't make it in even our best laboratories to blastocyst stage, in the uterus, still make it and can give you healthy babies. In other words, the uterus is still a better incubator than any one of our even now very, very sophisticated incubators in the laboratory where we can watch the embryos grow, etc., etc. So, why does PGTA not work? It has a, simply said, very high false positive rate. That's a very unusual circumstance with laboratory tests. Usually when we are talking about a poor test, it's a test that has a false negative rate, that misses things. But the problem with PGTA is that it overreads. It gives us a very high false positive rate. It says this embryo is not good, should not be transferred, should not be used, when in reality, a significant portion of these embryos, if transferred, will give you a healthy baby. How do we know that? We know that because in 2014, we, with Dr. Vidali in those days and another local physician, we decided to transfer selectively abnormal embryos. And in 2015, we were the first together to publish at the annual ASRM meeting in Baltimore. I will never forget it. The room was packed on the last day because it was a late entry submission for an oral abstract. We presented our first 4 healthy babies after transfer of so-called abnormal embryos. Nobody could believe it. Okay. Now, since then, I can't tell you how many healthy babies we have had, and a very small number of other IVF clinics are having, who have started transferring. Unfortunately, still a large majority of IVF clinics do not transfer, even though there's now overwhelming data that shows that at least certain groups of embryos can safely be transferred and will give you still surprisingly good pregnancy and live birth rates. So the false positive rate results in non-use of those embryos, whether they are discarded or, as is now more frequently happening since clinics have become very concerned about throwing out good embryos, they still don't transfer them, but they also don't dispose them, even though they have consents from patients to do so. So there are probably hundreds of thousands of frozen embryos sitting there that are not used because allegedly they are chromosomally abnormal. Now think about what this does. I previously mentioned the term cumulative pregnancy rate or cumulative live birth rate, which means all the possible pregnancies you can get from the embryos that are produced in one IVF cycle. Imagine if 40% of those embryos are false positive and therefore are not used, you have reduced your pregnancy chance for that cycle by 40%. And 40% is not a too high rate in terms of false positivity. It may actually be even higher than that. Now think about that for a moment. So you for all the wrong reasons don't use 40% of your embryos. Just think how effective PGTA has to be to just pull even to make up that difference that you lost by not using 40% of your embryos. So PGTA can never be that good. And therefore, in certain subgroups, PGTA actually hurts the chances of patients. Okay, I said already, no decline in miscarriages. Nobody argues about this anymore. Even ASRM acknowledges it, and no shortening in time to pregnancy. So why are we doing it? This is the opinion from September 2024, and in yellow, I'm quickly reading recent multi-center randomized controlled trials in women with available blastocysts concluded that overall pregnancy outcomes via frozen embryo transfer were similar between PGTA and conventional in vitro fertilization. That is now the formal ASRM and SART opinion. So I have to ask again, if there is no difference, and frankly, in my opinion, that is a very favorable interpretation of PGTA. I think, as I said, that in many cases, it actually hurts outcomes. But assuming that is correct, there's no difference, then why are we doing it? Why are we culturing all these embryos to blastocyst stage if it doesn't do anything? Why are we doing things that don't improve anything and just cost more money for an already almost unbearably expensive procedure? One of the unfortunate answers to the question that I just asked is that, of course, we have to see the world in a realistic picture. Money plays a role. PGTA represents income for IVF clinics. PGTA has become a powerful income source for genetic testing laboratories in our field. PGTA, in other words, has become an economic power in IVF. And that is a problem. And that made it very difficult over the years to speak out against the use of PGTA because the other side was very strong. They were the experts. They, after all, were the geneticists. They were running the laboratories. And so when we tried to submit papers to our journals, our reviewers were the people who had a strong interest in the performance of PGTA. And therefore, we found ourselves in a very strange situation. Usually, when something new is brought into medicine, it is up to those who want to bring it into practice to prove that it works. But again, I hope I have convinced you by now that nobody ever really proved that PGTA works. It was just introduced. And not only was there no evidence, But it wasn't the people who were supporting PGTA who were asked to finally provide the evidence. It was us, the people who opposed PGTA, who against resistance had to prove that PGTA didn't work. Exactly the opposite of how medicine usually works. And I have to say that applies not only to PGTA, unfortunately, in our field. I don't want to get into add-ons in general, but unfortunately, we have a lot of additional add-ons to IVF, which have also entered mainstream IVF practice without any evidence that they would be helpful. Indeed, with substantial evidence in many cases that they hurt IVF. But we found us in this paradoxical situation that we had to prove that the proponents of PGT who benefited from PGT were wrong, rather than they had to prove that they were right in supporting the use of PGTA. So again, going back a little bit to the history, our questioning of PGTA started as early as 2004. And it started in the relatively early days of IVF, still, when Belgian investigators in Brussels published 2 or 3 small prospectively randomized studies, which to everybody's astonishment, including mine, I have to say, I also at that time believed PGTA or PGS, as it was called then, was the greatest thing ever invented. But those 2 initial studies by Belgian investigators were the first to demonstrate that there was no outcome benefit from IVF. They were slaughtered by everybody. Indeed, if you had asked me when those 2 papers came out, I would have also criticized them. But then we did something that got the ball rolling for us. Dr. Barad and I reanalyzed these 2 studies that you see on the screen right now. Convinced that we would find evidence that their statistical analysis was wrong, that they had done something wrong that explained how come PGS, as it was called then, did not improve outcome. Couldn't be. Boy, were we surprised. What we found was that we were a tiny, tiny step away statistically from actually showing through these Belgian data that PGTA not only didn't work, didn't improve pregnancy rates, but in older women actually was harmful. And I have to say, we were not the only ones. Cedars from San Francisco and her group wrote a paper making a very similar point. Now, we wrote a paper in which we tried to make this point. And this paper got rejected. I've written over 500 papers in my career. Many of them got rejected once, twice before admission. I have never seen a paper rejected as many times as this paper was rejected by practically every journal, and not only in fertility journal. And then and other people also supported our findings. This is just one. And then something dramatically happened. A paper appeared in the New England Journal from colleagues from the Netherlands. First author was Sebastian Mastenbrooks. And they did exactly what we had concluded in reanalyzing the Belgian data, they did a prospectively randomized study of older patients with PGS, and they showed that in those older patients, actually pregnancy rates were significantly lower in patients who had PGTS than those who had standard IVF. And since the paper appeared in the New England Journal, it got a lot of attention. I have to say it didn't change practice, as we know, but it got a lot of attention, and something very funny happened. Alan DeCherney, who some of our listeners may know, he's a very widely respected and well-known REI, who was professor, chairman, president of the ASRM, editor of Fertility and Sterility in his long career. Alan DeCherney, who at that time was editor of Fertility and Sterility, the official journal of the ASRM, called me up and said after this Dutch paper appeared in the New England Journal of Medicine, he said, "Norbert, didn't you send me a paper that said the same thing that they are saying a year and a half ago?" And I said, "Exactly." And he said, "Okay, send it in again." And I resubmitted the paper after it had, as I said, been rejected in at least 25 medical journals, including Fertility and Sterility. And it finally did appear shortly after the Dutch paper in Fertility and Sterility. So there was a long history of proving that the PGS or PGTA hypothesis was wrong. We have published, I cannot tell you how many papers, but we have published a lot of work on this subject. These are just a few. And the next big step, which I was convinced would ultimately convince all the colleagues to stop doing PGTA, was when we, in late 2014, decided to start selectively transferring so-called chromosomally abnormal embryos. And this was still before the concept of mosaic embryos appeared in the literature. In those days, the question was just euploid, unemployed. Either an embryo was euploid or it was unemployed. And we started transferring selectively unemployed embryos who we know would never implant. And therefore, worst thing that could happen is that the patient wasn't getting pregnant. And shortly thereafter, as I already noted, in late 2015, we published our first healthy babies after such deliveries with Dr. Vidali and Dr. Braverman. I believe it was a month and a half later, Italian colleagues published 6 such cases in a research letter in the New England Journal of Medicine. Once again, we were convinced that it would change the practice. It didn't. Indeed, the use of what then quickly was renamed PGTA only increased. Despite all of those data, think about it again for a moment. What can be stronger evidence for the argument that PGTA doesn't work than transferring embryos that you should not have transferred because PGTA said don't transfer them, and you ended up with healthy babies? I don't think there's a strong argument to be made. Yet it had zero effect on national PGTA rate. To the contrary, they continued to increase and have been increasing to this day. the genetic testing industry, in response to those healthy babies, just renamed the procedure and introduced the concept of mosaicism, arguing that now we have better technology, a new name, a new start, and now we will prove that PGTA improves pregnancies, does all the things. And the cycle started all over again. And all over again, we and several other colleagues who had similar opinions had once again to prove that all the stuff that the genetic testing industry was presenting was basically hot air. So I don't want to go into too much detail about the diagnosis of mosaicism in an embryo. What mosaicism basically means is that there's more than one cell line in a being, and in this case, in an embryo. And that obviously should not be. And the point that the genetic testing industry initially made is that mosaicism explains some of the quote-unquote mistakes in the older PGTA or in the older PGS, and by not differentiating between pure aneuploidy and mosaicism, we can be more accurate. Now, initially, the genetic testing industry started making this differentiation between the two forms of aneuploidy, but in both cases recommended non-use and disposal of embryos. Over time, as we and others published papers that showed excellent pregnancy rates with mosaic embryos, they came kind of around, and some clinics started transferring so-called low mosaic, low percentage mosaics, which is again a nonsensical concept, because what percentage of mosaicism you get in 5 or 6 cells is pure crapshoot. I mean, has nothing to do with the biological reality of an embryo. And so, cut a long story short, the introduction of mosaicism actually confused the field even more than it was already confused, while there was only the binomic aneuploid euploid diagnosis. Things got even more entangled, things got even more confused, to such a degree that many clinics asked the laboratories to go back to just reporting embryos as either euploid or aneuploid. They just couldn't deal with the mosaicism question and didn't know how to explain it to their patients. And again, there were a lot of papers published by us and others showing that this whole concept didn't make any sense. Again, it was the opponents who were forced to show the evidence that the genetics industry was wrong. And the further paradox was, again, that the genetic industry were supposed to be the experts. Yet, they had absolutely no understanding of what they were doing. Not on a physiological level, and frankly speaking, also, at least in the early days, not on a technological level. So thousands of healthy euploid births after transfer of abnormal embryos with whether mosaic or aneuploid fortunately have happened since then. But as I said, we still haven't convinced a majority of colleagues and patients that they're wasting their time and effort and pregnancy chances very often if they use PGTA in their IVF cycle. We are reporting, we have a registry for transfer of abnormal embryos. As I said, we have been doing this since 2014 at the CHR. Interestingly, most the abnormal embryos we have been and are transferring are not our own embryos because most of our patients do not choose PGTA in the IVF cycle. So we have very few embryos that undergo PGTA at CHR, though we offer it if patients are insisting on it. The vast majority of chromosomally abnormal embryos we have been transferring and are transferring with increasing frequency are so-called abnormal embryos that are being shipped in from other clinics which are refusing their transfer. And so far, we have in all of our transfers not had a single required termination of pregnancy. And paradoxically, we have had euploid, listen carefully, euploid miscarriages after transfer of aneuploid embryos. That, I think, tells it all about the accuracy and the rationale of a routine PGTA. So the obvious question is, how come then PGTA utilization is still growing? How come you still read in medical journals obviously misleading papers on the subject, misleading in how data are being presented, but also misleading in simply interpreting published data? And how come neither ASRM, SART, or ESHRE or any other organization have really come out with a clear and loud statement, don't do it on everybody, and investigate in whom it might work? I'm convinced there are patients in whom it may show some advantages, but there are also patients where we already know, as I said, that it hurts. So be careful, individualize, do what's best for your patients. Don't give everybody the same strokes. We unfortunately relied on geneticists as the experts, and they unfortunately often don't understand embryo biology. I already mentioned the publication biases, which are also understandable because I cannot blame editors of medical journals to use as reviewers the experts. But if the geneticists are the experts, you can imagine what their opinions will be. And then we have generally a peer review problem in medical publishing. It's getting worse and worse because there are so many papers, and editors and reviewers are all overburdened, and the reviews, the quality of reviews have in general greatly declined. And finally, we live still in a world, even though everybody is talking about best possible evidence and everybody's recommending prospectively randomized studies. If you really look at the reality in medicine, and not only in our specialty, but maybe a little bit more so in our specialty than in other specialties, there is still a continued dominance of expert opinion over evidence. You just have to look at fertility and sterility. You have issues where over half the pages are filled with opinion, not with data. And that's something that is unfortunately happening in many medical journals. And then there is, of course, the industrialization, commercialization of IVF practice. don't have the time to go into it, but over half of all IVF cycles in the US are these days conducted in clinics which are no longer owned by doctors. They are owned by Wall Street, by private equity. So that obviously plays a big role because their primary responsibility is not toward patient, their primary responsibility is towards their shareholders. They have the responsibility of making profit. I cannot blame them. But that will lead to a lot of add-on use, to increasing costs for IVF cycles, etc., etc. So the economic conflicts are obvious, but on a personal level, I cannot blame the other side. I can only point it out. I want to come to the end by just showing you how easy it is to put something misleading into the literature. The most recent, I call it rumor, in the IVF field, and what I mean by that is the most recent argument why PGTA, after all, has a use, has been the argument made by some studies that have been published in fertility, sterility, and other leading fertility journals, which claimed that out of all patient groups, the patient group where PGTA really does work are older women. Now, I want to remind you that we and the Dutch group indeed demonstrated for the first time that PGTA doesn't work in older women. So close the circle, and now there were colleagues who really published a few papers making this argument. And Dr. Barat, it's obviously a nonsensical argument. So Dr. Barat decided to show how ludicrous it is and where the unrecognized biases are in doing this. And this figure demonstrates that so well. You see here a different age group of women. And you see in different colors over the years, the AMH levels, anti-Mullerian hormone levels. Now, anti-Mullerian hormone is one of the two hormones every IVF clinic uses to determine what is called ovarian reserve. And what you can see is that we go from 35 to 37, and then from 38 to 40, and then to women over 40, that the differences in AMH levels float apart. And what it basically means is that if you don't control in your studies for different patient characteristics, in this case, AMH, the data you will get will be strongly biased, because what these figures show is that the reason why it appeared as if in older women PGTA worked is because clinics obviously did PGTA only in those women with the best AMH levels, not in all women, or not in women with identical AMH, or did not correct the data. This can be done statistically for AMH levels. So by selecting out an obviously best group, well, they showed an effect against everybody else, but it was obviously an artificial effect. And the interesting thing was that even before Dr. Barat did the analysis, those are national, these curves that you see here are based on national IVF data in the US. When we were just talking, it was obvious to us that this had to be one of the reasons why these results were so ridiculous, arguing that in the group where you would least expect from PGTA, suddenly you're showing positive effects. I mean, how crazy. We predicted this. And so obviously this is, again, a national curve that Dr. Barat constructed. And you see that the patients who had no PGTA represent the lowest curve, meaning their AMH levels were lower. The patients who had the best AMH levels were the patients who did end up with PGTA. So in summary, PGTA not only does not improve IVF outcomes, but in many patients, it actually adversely affects outcomes, forces patients prematurely into egg donation. This is a very important point, which you hardly hear about in the literature, but we as a last resort center, we constantly see patients who come to us because they were told after having 2 or 3 IVF cycles with PGTA and either not conceiving or not even getting to embryo transfer because all of their embryos were declared to be unemployed. They were told your only chance is egg donation. Okay? So it is not only that PGTA makes women throw out many of their good embryos, but PGTA also forces lots, or has been forcing lots of women into prematurely into egg donation. And I don't have to tell you that that is obviously also not a great thing. So, except in rare clinical circumstances, we very strongly feel that PGTA should not be part of IVF. There are some rare exceptions, but they are really very rare. PGTA definitely should not be used routinely on everybody. And I can tell you that to this day, there are IVF clinics which will refuse IVF cycles if patients do not agree to have PGTA. I find that shameful. I mentioned the destruction of or non-use of huge embryo numbers with excellent pregnancy potential. Think about this worldwide. Think how many hundreds of thousands of embryos are being destroyed every year or not used every year because of PGTA. I think actually that there is no test in medical history, not only in infertility, in medical history, who has caused as much direct provable damage as PGTA. There are things that I don't even want to discuss because they are so minor in comparison to what I have been discussing. For example, Richard Paulson has been arguing for a long time that the biopsy that is required harms pregnancy chances. I'm not sure how much that is true. We have not studied it, and it's obviously hard to study. But there are additional reasons why you should not do PGTA. I have not heard about any reasons why you should do PGTA. And finally, again, I've mentioned it before, PGTA, at least in the US, adds roughly $5,000 to cycle costs, to already expensive cycle costs. And also, not mentioned very frequently, it is never covered by insurance, even if a woman has IVF insurance. That insurance will not cover PGTA, and therefore that cost will be carried by the patients out of pocket. Now, my final point, the craziness doesn't end here, because the genetic testing industry, obviously not my first love in this world, is going on to even crazier stuff. And I don't know if you have heard about polygenic risk scoring of embryos, but what that means is that you do a whole genome study, and based on multiple genes in models, you many times can predict risk for certain physiological occurrences or diseases, etc. It's important for you to understand that this polygenic risk scoring, which has become possible since the whole genome was analyzed, even in adult medicine, is still considered experimental. And even in adult medicine, is not even close to perfect. It will get better and better, I'm sure, especially with AI use, etc. But at least in adult medicine, you can measure how accurate your screening was, because we can follow patients 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, and say, okay, here we predicted the 40% likelihood, and we got a 40% likelihood. Or here we predicted A, but B happened. But imagine in an embryo. In that embryo, you don't even know whether that embryo will implant. And then you don't know anything about the epigenetic influences in the uterus, which are enormous. And you know nothing about the epigenetic influences on the born individual, the school he or she will be going to, whether she grows up in poverty or in a palace. And even the most advanced polygenic risk score will maybe give you 30, 40% of the total risk. The remaining 60, 70% come from the environment, from what happened to an individual during his or her lifetime. With embryos, we don't have follow-up, and the influences from the environment, including the time in our mom's wombs, is even bigger. Yet there are already genetic labs and IVF clinics out there that are selling this. And some in California are asking $50,000 for these tests, according to media reports. So things in certain ways are getting even worse, and therefore I am obviously not a big friend of the genetic testing industry. So in conclusion, we consider continuous unrestricted utilization of PGTA as unethical, to be very blunt. We feel that professional societies must stop wavering and issue practice guidelines that oppose utilization of PGTA outside of experimental protocols until clear evidence is produced by such protocols that PGTA works in certain patients. Until then, like anything else in medicine, PGTA should be an experimental procedure. we are not allowed to say, hey, I have a new drug, here, buy it. What's the difference? I don't think there is a difference. And medical journals also have a responsibility to improve the review process and to be fair in judging things. Thank you very much for listening. This is a picture of our building on 69th Street, corner Madison. And the names on the left are our staff people and some of our affiliates. I appreciate you listening to me. We have a few products in print, The Voice, which grew out of a little newsletter that we were publishing per typewriter 10, 12 years ago. And more recently, the Reproductive Times, where we post now 3 times a week. More acute comments to occurrence or to stuff that is relevant to the reproductive medicine field. And both are for free. You just need to get on our mailing list. And if you write to us or email us, we will be happy to add you. Thanks very much again for listening.
Okay, so thank you, Dr. Gleicher, for this outstanding and extremely really nice presentation and very, very interesting. It's always a pleasure listening to your speech. So as I mentioned before, this was a hot topic and Dr. Gleicher really explained us fantastically. Okay. So I know we have a couple of questions. Okay, the first one, if a clinic requires PGT, but a person doesn't really want to do anymore after viewing this research that you show us, what are their options?
Well, first of all, they should tell their clinic that what they have learned, maybe their clinic simply doesn't know it. And if the clinic doesn't change its mind, there are other clinics, you know. There are clinics on every corner now, and if they go to Google or now to any of the AI platforms, they even will give you a ranking of clinics.
Yeah, that's
Okay.
it. Okay, then there is another one, hold on, that says, curious to know your thought on invo cells.
On what?
Invo cells, INVO cell. I think is like a little thing where grow the embryos and then you transfer.
Oh,
you know which one, right?
Yeah, the culture, the
Yeah.
culture. Look, this is not necessarily a question that relates to PGTA. No. This is a question that really relates to how you run your embryology laboratory. I can only speak for our center, for CHR. We have a program with what I believe are excellent results. We have an excellent embryology. And we have all of that because we are very, very conservative in making changes. It is very easy to read an article where somebody says A, B, and C works and will give you better results. But wherever that was done, and even assuming that the data is true, that the analysis was done correctly, there can be huge differences between patient population between different clinics. And what works in one patient population may not work equally well in another patient population. And therefore, we have at CHR an ironclad rule. If we read something that sounds great, let's try it out. We do a very quick, short-term in-house study to look at it. And I can tell you that at least 9 out of 10 times, we have found it doesn't work, at least not in our patient population. Again, I don't want to say that it may not work in other patient populations, but in our patient population, it doesn't work. And ultimately, that's what you want to know.
Yeah.
Will it work for your patients? And therefore, my strong recommendation is that you be very, very careful in changing things if you have a well-functioning embryology laboratory. And as an embryologist, I think you will probably agree.
Oh, totally. Yeah, that's right. Okay. Sally?
I'm going to say something in my own webinar. Thank you, Dr. Gleicher, for that amazing presentation. But I want to point out, as someone who's been a fertility patient and technically what you would all call a failed fertility patient, you made a statement in the middle of your discussion that when we have a drug, we can't just bring it to market without proving it. And then you sort of said it again. There is so much in the fertility world that is being brought to the patient that isn't proven, that it makes this webinar so very important to watch. And even what you just said, like you'd run these mini studies in your clinic and you notice these things that everybody thinks is the next great amazingness, and then it doesn't work. And I think like people like you who are protecting the patients by making sure that things work are very, very important. That's it. That's all I had to say.
Thank you very much.
That's very true. That's very true. And I have two questions, okay? So how do you see as the path forward for changing the way clinics value PGT, and what can we do to help that mission?
Great question. But I can tell you I've been asking this question for 20 years. We have made progress. I think PGTA is viewed very differently today than it was just 2, 3, 4 years ago. But we're still not there because, as one of the earlier questions noted, some clinics even mandate it.
Yeah.
You have to ask yourself, why do they do that? I think the public will have to judge, and the public will have to educate the clinics. And if the clinics will notice that they lose patients by insisting on doing PGTA, the clinics will stop doing automatically PGTA. You know, in the end, medicine is an economic enterprise at all levels, and it follows market pressures. And I think it will come down to society learning enough about the benefits and the downsides of PGTA to change the discussion.
Yeah, very true. Yeah. Then, well, this is actually recently in one of the episodes of Endo Summit webinar about miscarriage with Dr. Vidali. I prepared a presentation that was about miscarriage that happened when with test and untested embryos, okay? So basically, we always talk about, I would say that in PGTA is always used more about implantation when we talk about implantation, but it's not actually too much explain, I mean, why even euploid embryos, get like miscarriage. And yeah, go ahead.
Well, there are obviously many reasons, but probably the most frequent reason for miscarriages of euploid embryos is the maternal immune system. Again, not the only by any means,
Yeah.
but probably the most frequent after chromosomal abnormalities. And so if you have a normal embryo, and that's why it is so important that if a woman does have a miscarriage, that miscarriage be tested to see if it is chromosomally normal or not. I feel that waiting for 2 or 3 miscarriages before you do this testing is crazy, especially in older women. Why wait until they have 2 or 3 miscarriages? Why not find out right away with the first miscarriage?
Exactly.
Yeah, and if the conclusion is that the miscarriage likely is immunological, there again, a whole variety of immunological reasons that need then to be figured out. And Dr. Vidali does that very extensively. And that needs then to be treated. And very frequently, infertile patients have also immunological problems in parallel. And I can also tell you that the natural history of what we call immunological infertility usually starts with miscarriages, meaning those women first have repeated miscarriages, and then as they get older, they also become infertile. In the beginning, they're not infertile. And so there is a very close connection between infertility and miscarriages in that regard.
Okay, very, very interesting. And so, by the way, it looks really that PGTA is overestimated about for miscarriages, for implantation, for many, things.
No good reason for
Yeah,
yeah,
exactly.
absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, I think we've done with the questions. Sally, do you have other comments or questions for Dr. Gleicher?
No, I want to thank him for kicking off our very first fertility webinar.
Yes.
And we're so grateful that you came, sir.
Anytime. Thank you
Okay.
very much for having me, and good night.
Good night,
Good night.
Dr. Gleicher. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
For
Bye.
those of us that are still on this link, we will begin our adenomyosis webinar at 8 p.m.